Hey, welcome back to the channel. Grab something to drink, get comfortable, because today's story is a long one. And trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word of it. And while you're settling in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. City, country, and what time it is there. Let's see where in the world we all are tonight. Now, let's get into it. Let me tell you something about the house. It was a Tuesday in October when we got the call from the Realtor, and I remember I was standing in the break room at work, eating a sad little cup of yogurt and trying to get through the last 2 hours of my shift when my phone buzzed and I saw the number and my heart just stopped. For a full second, I think my heart actually stopped beating. And then it started again, faster than before, and I walked out of that break room and into the hallway, and I answered the phone with the most professional voice I could manage, which was not very professional at all, because my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone twice. "Mrs. Patricia Campbell?" the Realtor said. "Speaking," I said. "I'm calling with good news." And that was it. That was the moment. 11 years of working double shifts and skipping vacations and driving a car with 200,000 miles on it and packing my lunch every single day and saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to the thing I needed. 11 years of all of that, and it came down to 4 words from a woman named Sandra at a real estate office in Decatur, Georgia. Good news. I put my back against that hallway wall and I slid down it until I was sitting on the floor right there in my work clothes, and I put my hand over my mouth and I cried. Not sad crying, the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep you didn't even know it was there until it surfaces. And when it does, you can't hold it in no matter how hard you try, and you don't even want to. My manager walked by and saw me sitting on the floor crying, and she stopped and said, "Patricia, what happened? Is everything okay?" And I looked up at her with mascara running down my face, and I said, "We got the house." She started crying too. She didn't even know the full story, and she started crying. That's how much it meant. You could feel it even from the outside. I called Marcus before I even got up off that floor. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting, and when I said we got it, he made a sound I had never heard from him before, this low, quiet sound, not a shout, not a yell, just a sound, like something releasing, like something he had been holding for a very long time, finally letting go. "Patricia," he said, just my name, just that. "We got it, baby," I said. We stayed on the phone for probably 3 minutes without saying much of anything, just breathing the same air through a phone line. 2 people who had worked and saved and believed and waited, finally on the other side of the waiting. That was the beginning of what I thought was the happiest chapter of my life. I was right that it was a chapter. I was wrong that it was the happy one. The happy one came later, after everything fell apart and got put back together the right way by the right person, which turned out to be me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. I met Marcus Campbell at a church picnic in the summer of 2004. I know how that sounds. I know church picnic sounds like the beginning of a very safe, very boring story. And I want you to understand that I am fully aware of that, and also that you are wrong, because that picnic led to one of the most complicated, painful, clarifying experiences of my entire adult life, and there is nothing boring about any of it. I was 32 years old. I had been in Atlanta for 6 years by that point, working as a medical billing specialist at a hospital in Decatur, living in a 1-bedroom apartment that I kept extremely clean because having a clean space was the one luxury I could afford. I was not looking for a relationship. I had been not looking for about 2 years at that point, which is the specific kind of not looking that happens after you've had one relationship end badly and you decide to spend some time just being yourself for a while. I went to that picnic because my friend Darlene from church practically dragged me and threatened to show up at my apartment and physically remove me if I tried to cancel again. Marcus was standing by the food table when I first saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of man who looks comfortable in his own skin in a way that some men never quite manage. He was talking to the pastor and laughing at something, and I noticed him the way you notice someone when your eyes just land on them and don't immediately move on. Darlene saw me notice and materialized at my elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "That's Marcus Campbell," she said, like she was handing me classified information. "Good family." Good family. Those 2 words, I have thought about them many times since. Marcus came over to the food table about 10 minutes later, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. Not flirting exactly, just talking. Real talking, the kind where you lose track of time because you're actually interested in what the other person has to say. He was smart and funny, and he listened, which is rarer than it should be. By the end of the picnic, I had given him my number, and he had made me laugh 4 times, and I had started the quiet, involuntary process of changing my mind about not looking. We dated for 2 years. He was patient and steady and present, and I fell in love with him the slow, solid way that I trusted more than the fast, electric way, because fast and electric had been my first serious relationship, and fast and electric had also been a disaster, so I had learned to be cautious. Marcus felt safe. Marcus felt like someone you could build something with. I met his mother, Beverly Campbell, about 3 months into us dating. And here is where I have to be very careful and very honest, because I don't want to tell you a story where the villain was obvious from the beginning and I was just too foolish to see it. That's not what happened. What happened is more complicated than that, and more human, and in some ways more painful, because it means I can't comfort myself with the idea that I should have known. Beverly Campbell was, when I met her, a 61-year-old retired school teacher from Macon, Georgia, who raised Marcus and his younger sister Diane largely on her own after their father passed away from a heart attack when Marcus was 15. She was a small woman, sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed, with the kind of posture that said she had standards and intended to maintain them. She shook my hand when we met, looked me up and down in a way that was so brief and so practiced I almost missed it, and said, "Marcus has told me so much about you." She hadn't said it was good things. I noticed that. I filed it away, and then I told myself I was being paranoid. She was perfectly polite during that first dinner, asked about my work, my family, where I was from originally. Memphis, I told her, born and raised, moved to Atlanta at 26. She nodded at everything I said. She smiled at the right moments. She served the best sweet potato pie I had ever tasted in my life, which I told her genuinely, and she thanked me graciously. Marcus drove me home that night and asked how he thought it went, and I said I thought it went fine, and I believed that when I said it. It was only later, much later, looking back with the clarity that only comes after you know the ending, that I could see what had been there from the very first dinner, the way her eyes moved between Marcus and me, measuring something, the specific questions she asked about my family, not curious questions, evaluating questions, the sweet potato pie, offered and received and logged in some internal accounting she was keeping, information about what I wanted and what I could be given and what could be withheld. Beverly Campbell was, from the very first moment she shook my hand, building a case. I just didn't know what the case was yet. Marcus and I got married in June of 2007. It was a beautiful wedding. Small, intentional, exactly what we both wanted. About 80 people, a church we both loved, a reception at a venue with string lights and good food, and a DJ who actually took requests. I wore a dress I had found at a consignment shop and spent 3 months altering myself because I was not about to spend $2,000 on something I was going to wear once. I carried gardenias because they were my grandmother's favorite flower, and my grandmother had passed the year before, and I wanted her there in the only way I could manage. Marcus cried when he saw me walk down the aisle. Real tears, right there in front of everyone, not even trying to hold them in. That's the Marcus I married. That's the man I said yes to. Beverly sat in the front row in a pale blue dress that was almost the same shade as the bridesmaids' dresses. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself it was a coincidence. The first year of marriage was good. Genuinely, honestly good. We were both working, both contributing, building a life together in the apartment we'd moved into after the wedding. We talked about the future the way people talk when they believe in it, as something real and reachable, not just a fantasy. We talked about buying a house. We talked about starting a family, maybe, when the time was right. We talked about what kind of life we wanted and what it would take to get there. Beverly came to Atlanta about once a month. She and Marcus were close. He was her oldest, her firstborn, the one who'd stepped up when his father died and taken on responsibilities that a 15-year-old boy shouldn't have to carry. I understood that closeness. I respected it. I had my own complicated love for my own complicated mother, and I knew that those bonds don't follow logic. What I didn't understand, what I was slow to understand because I was trying so hard to be fair and open-minded and not be the daughter-in-law who made things difficult, was that Beverly's closeness with Marcus had a specific texture. It wasn't just love, it was ownership. It was the particular kind of devotion that doesn't want to share, that sees a new person in her son's life not as an addition, but as a displacement, and responds to that perceived displacement by doing everything in its power to undo it. She was subtle about it. I cannot stress this enough. Beverly Campbell was the most subtle woman I have ever encountered in my entire life, and I grew up in a family where subtlety was considered a survival skill, so that is a significant statement. It wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say and when she didn't say it, and what she said instead. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, in a way I couldn't explain away, happened about 8 months into our marriage. Marcus and I had a disagreement, not a fight, a disagreement about money, specifically about how much we were putting into savings each month versus how much flexibility we had in our budget for things like eating out and the occasional weekend trip. Normal, boring, married people money talk. We talked it through, we compromised, we moved on. I thought nothing more about it. 2 weeks later, Beverly called Marcus. I was in the other room and I wasn't eavesdropping. Our apartment wasn't big enough for me to be in another room and not hear a phone conversation even if I wasn't. And I wasn't. And I heard Marcus say in this slightly defensive tone I didn't recognize, "It's not like that, Mama. Patricia and I talked about it and we figured it out." Pause. "No, I know what you're saying, but it's fine." Longer pause. "I said it's fine." He got off the phone a few minutes later and came into the living room, and I looked at him and said, "What was that about?" And Marcus said, "Nothing. She just worries." Worries? About what? About a budget disagreement that we had already resolved? What was there to worry about? I said, "Did you tell him about our conversation?" Meaning the money conversation. He said, "I might have mentioned it to his mother, a private conversation between a husband and wife about their household finances mentioned to his mother, who then called to express concern." I didn't know what to do with that, so I told myself that people talk to their mothers, that there was nothing wrong with that I was making something out of nothing. I was not making something out of nothing. I just wasn't ready to admit that yet. The house came into the picture in our third year of marriage, and it changed everything. Not because of the house itself, though the house mattered enormously, the house was everything, but because of what it revealed about where we all stood. Marcus and I had been saving seriously for a down payment for about 2 years. My contribution was significantly larger than his, not because he wasn't working hard, he was, but because I had been saving since before we got married, living small and disciplined for years, and I had a head start that was real and significant. By the time we were seriously looking at houses, I had put in approximately $72,000 to his $31,000. Our joint down payment fund was $103,000, and of that, about 70% was mine. We found the house in September and closed in October. It was a 3-bedroom Craftsman in a neighborhood in DeKalb County. Not fancy, but solid. Good bones, a big backyard, the kind of house that could be a home for a very long time if you took care of it. We put down $80,000 and financed the rest. Both our names went on the mortgage, both our names went on the deed. I want you to hold that in your mind because it matters later. Both names, equal ownership on paper, regardless of the unequal contribution that had funded the down payment. We moved in on a Saturday in November, and I stood in the empty living room with the afternoon light coming through the front windows, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a little girl in my grandmother's house in Memphis. The feeling of a place that was mine, truly, solidly. No one can take this from me, mine. I should have savored that feeling longer before I let anyone in. Beverly came to see the house the following weekend. Marcus picked her up from the bus station, and I had spent the better part of 2 days cleaning things that were already clean and cooking things I knew she liked and making the house look like the home I wanted her to see when she walked through the door. She came in and she looked around and she said, "It's smaller than I expected." That was the first thing Beverly Campbell said. Not "it's lovely," not "congratulations," not "I'm so happy for you both." The first thing out of Beverly Campbell's mouth, standing in the home that I worked 11 years and put $72,000 toward, was that it was smaller than she expected. Marcus laughed it off. "Mama, it's plenty big enough." She smiled and said, "Of course it is. I'm just surprised, that's all." She wandered through the house, room by room, making small sounds. Not negative sounds, not quite, but sounds that weren't positive either. Sounds that occupied the precise space between compliment and criticism so skillfully that you couldn't call her on them without seeming oversensitive. She touched things. She opened cabinets. She stood in the backyard for a long moment looking at the fence, and then she said, "Is that a chain link fence?" "Yes," I said. She said. Just that one sound, and I stood there in my backyard, in my house, and I breathed through my nose, and I said very pleasantly, "We're planning to replace it eventually when we have the budget." She said, "Of course." That weekend was the beginning of a new phase, a phase in which Beverly's presence in our lives became something I had to actively manage, like a weather pattern that you learn to anticipate and prepare for, not because you can stop it from coming, but because you can at least not be caught completely unprepared. Let me tell you about the next 3 years, because they matter. They were 3 years of slow erosion. Not the dramatic kind, not screaming fights or obvious cruelty or anything you could hold up and say, "Look, this is the thing that's happening." The slow kind, the kind that works like water on stone, where every individual drop is nothing and the accumulated effect of 10,000 drops is a canyon. Beverly called Marcus 3-4 times a week, not unusual for a mother who was close to her son, except that the calls were never just catching up. They were always information gathering, and the information gathered was always about me, about our marriage, about our money, about any friction between us, any disagreement, any moment of tension that Marcus had mentioned or would mention if she asked the right questions in the right way. And Marcus told her. Not because he was disloyal. I don't think he ever thought of it that way. He told her because she was his mother, and he had been confiding in her since he was 15 years old, and it was simply what he did. He didn't consider what it meant for me that his mother had a running account of every difficult moment in our marriage. He didn't consider that every piece of information she collected was being used for something. I noticed things changing in him gradually, a new habit of second-guessing decisions we had made together, not immediately, but after he talked to Beverly. A new tendency to revisit things we'd already resolved, to bring them back up as if they hadn't been settled. A new edge in his voice sometimes when we talked about money, specifically about the disparity in our financial contributions, which Beverly had apparently decided was worth his attention. "You know," he said one evening, about 3 years into living in the house, "my name is on that mortgage same as yours." We were in the kitchen. I was cooking, he was sitting at the table, and I could tell from the particular flatness in his voice that this had come from somewhere specific, that it was not an original thought, but a planted one. I put down my spoon, I turned around, and I said, "What does that mean, Marcus?" He said, "It means we're 50-50 on this house, legally." I said, "We're 50-50 on the mortgage. The down payment wasn't 50-50. He said, "I know that." I said, "Do you? Because you're bringing it up like it's something you just thought of, and I don't think it's something you just thought of." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "My mother thinks we should have a clearer financial agreement about what belongs to who." There it was, right there in the open for the first time. His mother thinks. I said, "Your mother thinks we should have a financial agreement about our marriage." He said, "She's not wrong that it would protect both of us." I said, "Protect us from what, Marcus? We're married. We live in this house together. What exactly are we being protected from?" He didn't have a good answer for that. The conversation ended, and we moved on, and I told myself it was just Beverly being Beverly, overstepping the way she sometimes did, and things would course correct and things would be fine. But things were not trending toward fine. Year 4 in the house. This is where the escalation begins. Marcus started pulling back. Not all at once, but gradually, incrementally, in ways I could feel but not quite prove. He was working longer hours, or said he was. He was going to visit Beverly and Mackin more often, weekends I sometimes wasn't invited to. He was quieter at home, more inside his own head, less present in the way that mattered. I tried to talk to him about it, more than once. I said, "Marcus, I feel like something is happening between us, and I want to understand what it is." I said, "If there's something you're unhappy about, I want to know." I said, "Are you okay? Are we okay?" He said we were fine. He said he was tired. He said work was stressful. He said I was imagining things. I was not imagining things. What I didn't know then, what I found out much later, was that Beverly had been actively, deliberately working on Marcus during those Mackin weekends. She had been telling him things, raising questions about whether our marriage was really working, whether I was really the right partner for him, whether he had married in haste. She had been raising questions about the house, specifically about what would happen to it if things didn't work out, about what his rights were, about what he was entitled to under Georgia law, about what he should know. She had been doing research, talking to people, divorced friends at her church, a cousin who had dealt with property disputes, building quietly and carefully a knowledge base about what Marcus could claim and how and when. I didn't know any of that until the night everything cracked open. It was a Thursday evening in March, about 4.5 years after we'd moved into the house. Marcus came home late. What was different was his face when he came in. He had a look I recognized from the days after his mother's visits, that particular combination of resolved and guilty that told me he had made some kind of decision. He sat down at the kitchen table and he said, "Patricia, we need to talk." I sat down across from him. I folded my hands on the table and I said, "Okay." And Marcus Campbell, the man I had married at a church with string lights and gardenias, told me that he thought our marriage had run its course, that he had been unhappy for a while, that he didn't think we wanted the same things anymore, that he thought it would be better for both of us if we separated. I sat very still while he said all of this. I did not cry, I did not yell, I did not throw anything or fall apart. I sat very still and I listened, and when he was done talking, I said very quietly, "Is this about the house?" He looked startled. "What?" "Is this about the house? Is your mother involved in this decision?" He said, "My mother has nothing to do with this." He said it too fast. He said it the way people say things when the answer is the opposite of what they're saying, and they know it, and they're hoping if they say it fast enough it won't leave room for follow-up questions. I said, "Marcus, I have been married to you for 16 years. I know when your mother has something to do with something." He didn't answer that. I said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing and why you're doing it and whether the reasons are actually yours." He said, "This is my decision." I said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. I got up from the table and I went to the bedroom and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. And then I did not fall apart. I did not spiral. I thought. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what Beverly knew. I thought about what she had been preparing for and how long she had been preparing for it. I thought about the house and the down payment and my name on the deed and the $72,000 that had come from my savings and my years of discipline and my sacrifice. And I thought about what I needed to do next. The next morning, I called my friend Cynthia. Cynthia Okafor had been my closest friend for 12 years. We had met at a professional development seminar, both the kind of women who get things done and don't have patience for nonsense. Cynthia was a paralegal at a family law firm in Atlanta, which meant she knew things that I needed to know. The first time I had introduced Cynthia to Beverly years ago, Cynthia had shaken her hand and smiled and said all the right things. Afterward, in the car, she had looked at me and said, "That woman doesn't like you." I had said, "She's just protective of Marcus." Cynthia had said, "Patricia, that woman does not like you." I had changed the subject. Now I called her at 7:30 in the morning and I told her what Marcus had said the night before. I told her about the house, about the down payment, about Beverly's questions over the years, about all of it. Cynthia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, first thing, do not move out of that house. Do you hear me? Do not leave that house under any circumstances." "I wasn't planning to," I said. "Good. Second thing, you need to talk to a family law attorney today, not tomorrow, today." "Do you know someone?" "I know several someones. I'm going to text you a name and a number, and I want you to call as soon as we hang up." "Okay." "Patricia?" Her voice shifted, softer but no less serious. "Do you have documentation of your financial contributions to the house? Bank records, transfer records, anything that shows where the down payment money came from?" "I have my savings account records. I have the transfer records from when I moved money into our joint account for the down payment." "Get them. Cynthia said. Get everything. Go through every account, every document, anything that touches that house financially, and don't tell Marcus you're doing it. Why not? Because if Beverly is involved in this, and I think she is, then this is not just a marriage falling apart. This is a strategy, and you are not going to fight a strategy without one of your own. The attorney's name was Diane Foster, one of the best family law attorneys in DeKalb County, which was exactly the county where my house was located and therefore exactly the county that mattered. I sat across from her that afternoon with a folder of documents I had spent the morning gathering: savings account statements, transfer records, the original mortgage documents, the deed, everything relevant, and I told her everything. Diane listened. She was maybe 55, with natural hair gone almost fully silver and reading glasses she kept taking on and off. When she finished, she said, "Tell me about the deed." I said, "Both our names, joint tenancy." She said, "And the down payment, you're certain about the breakdown. $72,000 from your separate savings, $31,000 from his." "I have the bank records. Every transfer is documented." She nodded. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. The source of funds matters. Separate property, money you had before the marriage, or money that can be clearly traced to a separate source, is treated differently than marital property. The savings I put toward the down payment, some of it I had before we got married, and some of it I saved during the marriage. How much from before? I had done the math that morning. About $41,000. Diane made a note. That $41,000 has a strong argument for being your separate property. The documentation of your overall contribution matters significantly. I said, "What is Beverly's role in all of this? Can a mother-in-law actually influence a divorce settlement?" Diane looked at me over her reading glasses. "Not directly," she said, "but if she has been coaching Marcus, advising him on strategy, helping him understand what he might be entitled to, then she is influencing the process even if she's not a legal party to it." "How would I know if that's what she's been doing?" "You might not," she said, "unless something comes out. But the fact that your husband raised questions about legal ownership of the house in language that sounded researched rather than spontaneous, that suggests he's been getting information from somewhere." "What do I do?" I asked. Diane said, "You do several things, and you do them in the right order." The order mattered. Every step had to be taken deliberately, carefully, in sequence. Step 1 was documentation. I went home that evening and I spent 4 hours going through every financial record I had, organizing everything by date and category, every savings statement, every transfer, every mortgage payment, and I was the one who had been making the mortgage payments, could prove it with bank statements going back years, every home improvement expense, every dollar I had put into that house. I created a spreadsheet. I created a file. I backed it up in 3 places. Step 2 was protecting the asset, making sure I was current on the mortgage, documenting the current condition of the house with dated photographs, understanding exactly what we owed and what the house was worth and what equity we had built. Step 3 was something I did on my own. I deepened my relationships with our neighbors, not about the divorce, not about Beverly, just showing up. I had been a good neighbor for almost 5 years. I knew the Washingtons next door, the Peterson family across the street, Mrs. Amos in the corner house who had lived there for 30 years. I showed up with food when Mrs. Amos had a cold. I helped the Washington kids with a school project. I was present and visible and known. Because a home is not just a financial asset, it is a life, and the life lived in that home mattered. I was making sure everyone knew who had lived that life. Step 4 came from Cynthia, and it was the step that changed everything. Cynthia called me about 3 weeks after the separation had begun, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to stay calm when I tell you." "Okay," I said. "A woman came into our office today. She was inquiring about property division in a divorce scenario. Hypothetically, she said. She wasn't there for herself, she said." I said nothing. She was asking very specific questions about equitable distribution in Georgia, about what a spouse is entitled to when one spouse contributed more to the down payment, about how marital property is defined when funds came from separate savings. The room felt very still. "What did she look like?" I asked. Cynthia described her. Small woman, 60-something, impeccably dressed, sharp eyes. "Did she give a name?" I asked. "She gave a first name," Cynthia said. "Beverly." I sat down. There it was, right there, undeniable, impossible to explain away. Beverly Campbell had walked into a family law office and asked, hypothetically, exactly the questions she would need answered if she were helping her son build a legal strategy to take my house. She had gotten sloppy, or maybe she just hadn't expected that the law office she walked into on a random Thursday afternoon would have my best friend sitting at the front desk. I said, "Cynthia, thank you." "What are you going to do?" she said. "Win," I said. I called Diane that same evening and told her what Cynthia had told me. Diane was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's useful information. It tells us that your mother-in-law has been actively involved in strategizing about the divorce. It tells us that Marcus's position is coached, and it tells us that they have been focused specifically on the house. What does that mean for me?" It means we prepare for a fight over the house, and we prepare thoroughly. They've had a head start. We're going to make sure we have more. Diane filed for divorce on my behalf because if this was happening, I was going to be the one to initiate the process, not waiting for Marcus to file when Beverly decided the timing was right. She filed alongside the divorce petition a motion for exclusive use of the marital home during the proceedings. This meant that while the divorce was being resolved, I had the legal right to remain in the house. Marcus moved out within 2 weeks, to his mother's in Macon, which put them in the same house every evening, which was exactly what Beverly had always wanted, and which meant they were in constant communication about the case, which Diane had anticipated and prepared for. The discovery phase was where the truth surfaced. Marcus's attorney requested financial disclosures from both sides. My disclosures were complete, documented, organized, and delivered ahead of schedule. Every bank statement, every transfer record, the spreadsheet showing every dollar I had contributed to the house, every mortgage payment, every repair receipt, all of it, clear and legible and dated and real. Marcus's disclosures came in late, and when they came in, they contained something interesting. Among his disclosed assets was a savings account I had not known about, a separate savings account in his name only, which he had been contributing to for approximately 3 years. The balance was about $18,000. Diane flagged it immediately. "This suggests he was preparing for something," she said. "You don't open a separate savings account and fund it for 3 years in a marriage unless you are planning for a future that doesn't include the marriage." 3 years. That account was 3 years old, which meant that while I had been trying to save our marriage, while I had been asking him if we were okay, while I had been making dinners and paying bills and maintaining the home we shared, he had been quietly, steadily putting money into an account I didn't know about, preparing to leave. I sat with that number. I let myself feel it, and then I put it away and I focused on what it meant for the case. It meant that Marcus's claim to an equal share of the marital home was significantly weakened by his own behavior. It meant that Diane now had ammunition she had not had before, and she used it. The mediation session was the moment I finally saw Beverly's plan laid out in full because Gerald, Marcus's attorney, presented it with a specificity that could only have come from months of preparation. Marcus was claiming 50% of the equity in the house. His argument, joint tenancy, equal legal ownership, equitable distribution under Georgia law. Beverly's research, Gerald's expertise, Marcus's signature. Diane's response was methodical and devastating. First, the documented financial contribution, $72,000 from my separate savings, 41 of which predated the marriage and had never been fully commingled with marital funds. The paper trail was clear, the transfers were dated, the accounts were identified. Second, the mortgage payments. I had made every mortgage payment for 5 years, not half of them, all of them. The mortgage itself, the actual debt service on the house, came from an account I funded, documented, dated, proven. Third, the home improvements. Every repair, every upgrade, the new roof in year 2, the kitchen renovation in year 3, the HVAC replacement the year after that, came from my income and my savings, documented, dated, proven. Fourth, the hidden savings account. 3 years of Marcus quietly moving money out of our shared financial life into a separate account. Diane framed it as evidence of premeditation, a spouse preparing to dissolve the marriage while allowing the other spouse to continue bearing the financial burden of their shared life. Fifth, and this was the piece that I think Gerald surprised most because I believe Beverly had not told him about it, Cynthia's account of Beverly's visit to the law office. Diane presented a careful, factual account of what Cynthia had witnessed, a woman matching Beverly Campbell's description, giving her first name as Beverly, coming into a family law office and asking specific hypothetical questions about equitable distribution in Georgia divorce cases involving disputed down payments. She did not call Beverly a schemer. She did not call her manipulative. She simply presented the fact of what had happened and let the mediator draw her own conclusions. The mediator drew conclusions. I could see it in her face. Mediation went to a second session. There were proposals and counter-proposals, long conversations between Diane and Gerald. Marcus held his position for longer than I expected, which told me Beverly was still pressing, still convinced the plan she had built for years was going to work. It didn't work. In the end, here is what was agreed to. The house was awarded to me, sole ownership, my name and my name alone on the deed going forward. Marcus received a cash settlement of $28,000, representing his portion of the marital equity after accounting for my separate property contribution and the fact that I had been servicing the debt alone. $28,000 from a house that had appreciated to well over $300,000 in value. He had gone in hoping for $120,000. He walked away with $28,000. He was responsible for his own legal fees. I want you to think about the math of what Beverly had orchestrated and what it had cost her son. He spent money on an attorney. He spent months in conflict. He damaged his relationship with me and his own reputation among our friends, and he walked away with $28,000 from a house he had never paid the mortgage on. That was the return on Beverly's investment. I sat in Diane's office after the final documents were signed, and I felt something quieter than triumph, something more like the feeling I had standing in the break room all those years ago, getting the phone call that said good news. Relief. Deep bone-level relief, and underneath the relief, something even quieter. The knowledge that I had done exactly what needed to be done, exactly when it needed to be done, without losing my dignity or my composure or my sense of who I was. Diane shook my hand and said, "You are an exceptional client, clear-headed, prepared, disciplined." She paused. "I've had a lot of clients in situations like yours. A lot of them would have made decisions out of anger. You didn't." "I didn't have the luxury," I said. She smiled at that. "None of us do, but most people forget it." I want to tell you about the day I drove back to the house after everything was finalized. It was a Friday afternoon in September. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in Atlanta in early fall, deep and clear, the kind of blue that makes you feel like anything is possible if you just stay steady. I pulled into the driveway and I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the house. My house. I got out of the car and I walked up to the front door and I put my key in the lock and I opened the door and I walked into my home. The afternoon light was coming through the living room windows the way it always did. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My furniture, my pictures on the walls, the quilt my grandmother made that had been in my family for 3 generations and that I brought from Memphis when I moved to Atlanta at 26. I stood in the middle of that living room and I turned around slowly, the same way I had turned around the day we moved in all those years ago. And I felt it again, that feeling, mine, truly, solidly, no one can take this from me, mine. Except this time it was true in a way it hadn't been before. This time there was no other name on the deed. This time there was no other agenda hiding in plain sight. This time it was just me and my house and the years of work that had made it possible and the months of clarity and strategy and refusing to fold that made it permanent. I sat down on my couch in my living room in my house, and for the first time in a very long time, I exhaled. Beverly, as far as I know, never acknowledged what she had done. People who operate the way she operated typically don't sit down one day and say, "Yes, I spent years quietly working to undermine my daughter-in-law's marriage so my son could claim her house." That kind of person finds a way to be the wronged party in every story, including the ones where they caused the wrong. I heard she told people I had been difficult in the marriage, that I had pushed financial concerns over the relationship, that I had pushed Marcus away. People who knew me knew better. I had stopped concerning myself with what Beverly said about me around the time I signed those final documents. You can only control so much, and what Beverly Campbell thought of me and said about me to people I would never meet was so far outside the circle of what I could control that giving it any energy at all was a waste of resources I needed for better things. Marcus and I have not spoken since the divorce was finalized. I don't wish him harm. I don't spend energy being angry at him. He was, in a very real sense, a product of what his mother had made him, a man who had learned to let her navigate his life and then found himself at 48 years old executing a plan he had only partially understood and walking away with far less than he had hoped. I hope he found his way to something real. I hope someday he found the version of himself that existed before Beverly decided who he should be. But I hope it from a considerable distance. Cynthia came over for dinner the month after everything was settled. I cooked, really cooked, the kind that takes all afternoon and fills the whole house with smell. We sat at my kitchen table and we ate and we talked, and at some point she looked around and said, "This house suits you." I said, "I know." She said, "It always did." I refilled her glass and I thought about that for a moment because she was right, and the rightness of it went deeper than she probably meant it to go. The house had always suited me, not because of the architecture or the neighborhood. It suited me because I had built it into something, because every mortgage payment and every repair and every Sunday morning making coffee in that kitchen and every evening sitting on the back porch watching the yard go through its seasons had made the house mine in a way that went past the legal definition of ownership. Beverly had understood something true about that house. She had understood that it mattered, that it represented something real, that fighting over it was worth the years of effort she put into the fight. What she had not understood was that you cannot fight your way into someone else's story and win. The house was mine not just because of the documents, though the documents mattered. It was mine because of the life I had lived in it, the care I had given it, the community I had built around it. That's not something you can claim through legal maneuvering or coaching or quiet research in a law office. That's something you have to earn. She didn't earn it. I did. My grandmother's quilt is still on the back of the couch where I put it when we first moved in. I've washed it twice in 8 years, very carefully, cold water, gentle cycle, laid flat to dry. It is faded in places where it has been faded for decades, worn soft in the places where the most love was put in. She made it for her own home, my grandmother, carried it through her own life, through hard years and good ones, through things I only know pieces of because she told me pieces, the way grandmothers do. She left it to me specifically because she said I was the one who understood about things that last. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to be the one who understands about things that last, about the kind of patience and work and refusal to quit that's required to build something that endures, about the forces in this world that look at something someone else has built and decide they want it, and the forces that look at the same thing and decide to protect it. I have always been the second kind of force. Beverly spent years betting that I could make me the first. She lost that bet. And every morning when I unlock my front door and walk into my house, the one with my name on the deed and my grandmother's quilt on the couch and my key in the lock, I know she lost it. Some things you earn. Some things you fight for. Some things, once you have them, you hold on to with both hands and you do not let go, no matter what anyone tries. This house is mine. It always was.